Okay, so for our panel today, we have Melissa Erikson. Melissa is Principal and Director of Community Design Services for MIG, a multidisciplinary firm. Based out of their Portland office, she oversees their firm-wide landscape architectural practice. Melissa grew up finger tracing land contours on National Geographic maps and is now shaping them in the public realm for people of all ages and abilities. Her work encompasses a diverse range of outdoor spaces, from parks and plazas to trails and streets, with the common purpose of connecting people to nature and fostering positive associations to story, memory, and place. And we have Keegan Oneal. So Keegan is a University of Oregon alum and senior designer at Hargraves Jones in New York City. Currently, Keegan is collaborating on renovations at Discovery Green in Houston, Texas, and a public park design in downtown Brooklyn. Previously, he worked at the International Rescue Committee, where he focused on food security and environmental justice advocacy, and at Michael Van Valkenburg Associates, MVVA, where he was a senior project manager. While at MVVA, he coordinated the earthworks, environmental engineering, and soil remediation aspects of river valley excavation and public space development for the Portland's Flood Protection Project in Toronto, Ontario. And David Fletcher. David is the founding principal of Fletcher Studio. He has practiced in landscape architecture for 30 years and has worked on the planning, design, and construction of projects ranging in scale from regional watersheds to furniture design. David's formative education in field biology and fine art created an eclectic foundation where urban ecology, pop culture, and the California landscape intermingle with the everyday. So thank you so much, panelists, for being here, and I'll hand it off to Nancy and Hannah.
All right, thank you, Caroline. So we're just gonna jump right into the panel. And we're gonna start with kind of a broad question and then we'll get narrower, but just in general, what makes an applicant stand out? That's, the question that everyone's dying to know, just in their application, in their portfolio, et cetera. Yeah, take it away.
Well, I'll start, Keegan, and give you a little time to think on that one. So it sometimes just comes down to the basics. Can you write a good cover letter? Do you know who you're applying to and why? I think it's sometimes just doing your basic due diligence that helps you even make it through the first round. I will say that's not true for everyone, but I've done a bunch of different reviews. I've done a lot of both for selection for programs as well as hiring. And I will say the cover letter, I'll take it, scan it, and if it doesn't grab me, I'll put you in another pile. I might look at you again, but the cover letter really is kind of what's going to get me. It's worth taking the time to prove it. Make sure you've got complete sentences, that you know why you're kind of making that connection. I think kind of related to that is trying to figure out specific aspects of what you're looking for addressing and how that relates to the firm, so that you're kind of showing that you're making those connections. I will admit I'm a bear, so sorry. I'd like to say I'm an honorary duck, but when I was doing grad school admission components, I would laugh looking through the applicants because they'd be applying to go to Cal because they want to do golf course design. I thought, you obviously didn't take a look at what that program offers. So sometimes I think that applies also to the job, and just really making sure that you're true, don't oversell, be honest, but if there's something that can kind of create that hook about why this job, that's the thing that's going to make me curious to try and find out. And then I'll look at the portfolio. But for me, it's the letter.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't even thought of the letter when I was thinking about this question beforehand, but I've had several employers explicitly tell me, hey, we wanted to talk to you because of your letter. We really enjoyed reading it, and just all it took was that basic due diligence that you just talked about. And also, when I was thinking about this question, there's what makes an applicant stand out, and there's stand out good and there's stand out bad. Golf course design at Berkeley is like stand out bad. And then stand out good. I bring the perspective of someone who's maybe in the more middle tiers of a larger firm. And so who I'm looking for is someone I want with me kind of in the trenches, you know, who's a new hire, you know, especially all of you are still in school, you're looking for that entry level position, like who's got the technical skills and, you know, spatial skills and spatial thinking in order to, you know, like meet the basic requirements for the job. Like who do I want to train and work alongside? And I think that U of O has the tech studio, which is really important. At least it was in my own experience, and having that strong foundation in CAD, how to speak that language. And that doesn't always manifest in the portfolio itself, but you know, in graphic clarity, that might come through. And then when you're speaking about your basic skill set that you're bringing to the table, that's important. But that's like fine-grained stuff. When I'm thumbing through a portfolio, some other things that stand out are context. So thinking about like key plans or site plans, you know, that can help someone who's just opening your portfolio cold. They didn't spend, you know, a whole 10-week term or 16-week semester working on the project that you're so intimately familiar with. It's like you're going to have to leave a breadcrumb trail behind for the reader of your portfolio so that they can understand just the basics. Like, and that does two things. It shows that you're able to communicate context and a site very briefly and concisely. And it also shows place-based knowledge that you've gained by working on a particular site in a particular context. So there's no like rules of thumb. Some people are fancy. They want a little, you know, like state map in, you know, each spread of their portfolio. That could be fine. But I think really the watchword is context. Like when I'm opening a portfolio, is someone, you know, leaving me clues behind so that I can understand the thought behind all of the work. In presentation of your actual portfolio, when you're like, so the purpose of the portfolio and the resume and the cover letter, that trifecta, is to get you in the room, to get you past that first round and get you interviewing. And so when it comes down to actually presenting your portfolio, think about the 1, 2, or 3 things that you want to convey with each of your spreads. I think I'll maybe tag team off to Melissa. I could keep rattling off, but I don't know if that got your motor running, Melissa, about any standout good or standout bad.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it somewhat depends on what the position is that we're hiring, but you know, I agree, Keegan, on all those fronts. And I think it's, you know, I want to see something that makes me want to talk to you. So I want to be curious. So the more you can kind of be concise, but give me enough that I kind of go, oh, could you do this? Could you do this? What are you interested in? So I'm looking for something that's going to pique my curiosity. I don't necessarily want you to tell me everything, but I want you to make me curious to find out what's behind it. And so, you know, what does that mean, right? You know, so you have to kind of figure out what we're trying to say. But I think, you know, trying to figure out what that kind of special sauce is, what is it about the project, your contribution, what you're trying to look for, and trying to figure out what is that quick little story bite that's going to get someone to kind of go, oh, because I'm looking for collaborators. I'm looking for people who are wanting to kind of be part of a larger team. And the more that I can kind of see that potential and fluidity, and just kind of want to go, oh, this is a kind of a curious thing. You know, the things that are kind of the little zingers or the surprises, that's where I get really interested. You know, it's where someone has something in there and all of a sudden I realize, oh my gosh, they, you know, played bassoon through, you know, college or whatever. And then I want to, you know, kind of figure out how that connects. It may not, but, you know, it's kind of trying to figure out, you know, what are those pieces? Because I want to know who you are. I mean, obviously you have a skill set, resume, experience, you've got a portfolio, but it does come down to fit and personality too. And like, how does that kind of factor into it? So trying to be clear about who you are and what you're wanting people to respond to is, I think, the piece to try and struggle with and try and figure out how best to convey that.
Yeah, I think the cover letter point was a really good point, that I think there's so much pressure put on the portfolio. So like just being reminded that cover letter matters too. And what you said, part of what you just said, Melissa, really transitions into the next question of like concise and kind of like a little taste. Like breadth versus depth. Like, do you show a lot of projects, kind of very surface level? Do you show a few more in depth? So yeah, just basic breadth versus depth question.
Both.
Yes.
Right.
I was gonna say, yeah, I want it. I want it all. Keegan, you go first on this one.
Yeah, this really comes down to, for me, at least in my own experience, breadth versus depth. It's about having both and leaving myself the flexibility to do both. So as each of you are developing your portfolio layout, another standout good is like cohesive text, coherent and uniform typeface, type size, graphics. You don't want a lot of clashes of different graphic styles in your portfolio. If that means redrawing things, so goes. But as you're making that layout, and I still use mine that I made in school now as a professional, it's like rule of thirds and a baseline grid. It's nothing fancy, but that allows me to move information in and out really flexibly. So I have some drawings that can take up a full spread. A single drawing can take up a full spread, and I can adapt it that way. I've also formatted it so that it's on a single page. So leaving yourself the flexibility in your format to do a little bit of both, and you got to cater it to the office that you're applying to. If you're applying to an office that does a lot more planning oriented or landscape scale projects versus a lot more site design, like traditional, constructed built landscape architecture, those are going to be two different types of portfolios, or I'm going to cater mine to be one of two. And then the last thought on breadth versus depth for the moment is don't make it more than like 25 or 30 pages in a PDF, like period. Like it's going to be wonderful. You guys are all going to do beautiful portfolios, but don't send anybody a 60-page manifesto. Like send it to mom, but hold back some of that information and feel free to bring it to your actual interview. If you're printing one copy of your portfolio and then you have a digital version that you're modifying so that stays light and nimble, and then maybe you have your book that you would physically bring, in a post-pandemic world.
Yeah, I would totally take up of that. It's who's your audience and what is that firm? What are you looking at for providing as far as a position? What's going to best resonate based on the type of work they do, and kind of adjust for that. That said, we are not a traditional landscape firm because we're multidisciplinary. We're kind of all over the board. So I'm looking for people who can do a really broad range. So I'm going to be really excited about someone who can write, who can do analysis, who maybe even has some policy background, who can do great hand graphics, can do great, renderings, can do construction documents, knows GIS, MicroStation, the whole kind of kit and caboodle. But it, again, depends on the position that we're hiring. So I think, that depth and breadth really is, I totally agree with, no more than 25 or 30 pages. It's all about kind of what's concise, what's going to help tell your story. How do you tell your story in a really compelling and kind of somewhat pithy way, but enough that people kind of want to know more, is really kind of the piece that's going to happen. Because typically when positions are posted, there's a lot of applicants. So you've got a bunch of different pieces. So the clearer you can make that connection for someone to go, oh, this person might be a good fit, they go into my next pile for further review kind of discussion, is certainly going to be really helpful for that process. I think be prepared to talk about what your role was. A lot of projects and portfolios are group projects. That's totally fine. That's great. But don't claim more than what your role was, and just be clear about that. Most firms do work collaboratively. That's kind of what we expect. That's what we want. But being able to articulate kind of, role delegation or what you contributed, how that process worked, is also a piece just to kind of keep in mind, probably more for the interview. But as you're putting it to the portfolio, I think it's kind of helpful to start thinking about those components as well.
Those are, again, some really great points. And I think speaking to a little bit of who you are and these collaborative efforts, one thing we were wondering about is maybe what may of you have seen in a portfolio that would represent a student's design thinking, or maybe that's something that's outside of studio work, but something that represents who they are, as once again, you're saying, we're going to be working together on, you know, as a team. Bassoon, for instance.
I, just out of my own personal experience, I included a really expressive work of, you know, an artwork on my cover. I'm not a particularly artistic person. You know, when I showed up at grad school, I had barely ever drawn, you know, in my life, and like many of you, I'm sure. But I had created this really beautiful image in studio just as process work, and I threw it on the cover. You know, I was able to adapt that image to be a cover, and people always ask me, "This is cool. What is this? You know, what am I looking at?" It's a very abstract thing. So again, like Melissa said, that curiosity and leaving the door open for that. I think another catching thing is connections across modes or media. Like if you've built a physical model that was then turned into drawings or details that then maybe turned into a built object, you know, showing that thinking through drawing and making is also something that I get excited about, and people like seeing in like models that I've made too.
I've seen a whole range of things, both on the good and the bad. But I think if you're looking for trying to kind of, you know, things that are maybe outside the box a little bit, some of the more compelling ones that kind of jump to mind are, I remember a couple applicants that had done a robust amount of volunteer work. I can't remember if it was AmeriCorps or what exactly it was, but they had some hand-on practical experience, kind of both with grassroots organizing and kind of implementation and actually then construction of some infrastructure components. And they were able to kind of convey that in a way that was very interesting to see them actually take a look at the application and kind of like the physical reality versus the theoretical. Because I think, you know, that's always kind of the hard piece to kind of make the transition. I've had people submit music that they wrote, which I did listen to, and it certainly made me kind of curious. The bassoon reference was a different one, but that's come up too. I've had some interesting things where people have done some creative writing, prose. They've had published work, you know, in an entirely different field. Folks have done like photography, you know, just that they really love doing, that they had kind of like a reason for why it was in there. They had a very kind of pithy, kind of how that related component. I think there's kind of a range within that to try and take a look at. But again, I think it's all about being authentic. You know, if you're overly tooting, you know, the small factor gets pretty high. And so then that kind of, you know, makes people start questioning. So I think the biggest part is really to try and figure out what's authentic and what's really going to kind of convey you, because that's the piece that you're putting out there, right? And so you don't want to go somewhere where that's not a good fit. So I think being comfortable enough and confident enough without being cocky, but enough to kind of put it out there is really that kind of piece. But I think trying to think about what else do you bring besides the education? You know, is it a foundational experience? Is it some kind of personal thing that gave you insight? You know, is it a travel experience? You know, it could be, it's, you know, can be kind of random, but I think as long as you can make that connection about what that does as far as a skill set, personality, your ability to collaborate, your creative potential, your ability to see something beyond what's there. I just encourage you to kind of, you know, push the boundaries a little bit. That obviously isn't the push of it, but I do think that when you're kind of calling together your portfolio, trying to think about what are those pieces that make you, because that's part of what gets people excited, because it is all about people.
Wonderful. Thanks you guys for those insights. Speaking on, well, connections and this new type of connection that we're having, students were curious about advice for entering the job market in a post-pandemic world, which I'm guessing has been a question that's been thrown around a lot. And I like the idea of post-pandemic world.
You should all make sure that on your resumes, you're talking about that you're very good at Zoom meetings. You can organize them, you can facilitate them, you can do the breakout rooms, you can use a whiteboard, you can use Miro. I mean, the whole set of tools that you guys, I'm assuming, are doing every day, numerous times, are incredibly valuable skill set. So make sure that you put those on your resume. You know, who knows what's going to happen, but we certainly aren't going to go just back to the way it was. And a lot of the work that we do is public. It has public, you know, community engagement processing. Those skills to be able to help facilitate in a remote fashion, you know, or with a broader, you know, geography where people don't necessarily have to travel, is incredibly valuable. And everyone is using it. And so list the platforms, you know, go through the whole little piece, but they're all really kind of helpful to try and take a look at. So that's more typically actually just like this type of meeting. But I think in trying to look for a job, the good thing is everyone is getting used to this. So you don't have to necessarily anticipate that you have to travel. A lot of people are working remotely. A lot of firms don't have plans to go back in the office, or at least a set date. So I think there's a lot more flexibility on that front. Definitely be doing, you know, scouting out on websites and checking all the hiring pages and taking a look through that option. Think about your file size, because that's the other thing, since everything is going to be sent. I would not send anything in the mail. I would do everything by email. I think it's also important, you know, as you're doing your due diligence on the firms, to try and have a specific contact, or at least make some connections so you have a name that you can put out there, because that just helps. Again, especially when there's a lot of people applying, and or it's a, you know, highly desired geographic area, you know, whatever those components are, the more that you can have a connection to make it through that first phase, the better off. And so, you know, having a name that you can mention in the letter that you talk to, or sending it to a specific person in addition to the generic hiring, I think is definitely a helpful component. But definitely market your skills at using kind of the virtual platforms. It's not going away. And so the more skilled you are, and the more diverse that skill set you have, just like software, is really, really critical and helpful.
The remote platform thing is huge, especially for, I don't know about you, Melissa, but basically all of the consultants that I work with. So these are the engineers, you know, maybe our planners, architects that we're collaborating with. I almost exclusively worked with all of those consultants over GoTo. You know, so it was always GoTo meetings with a PDF. You know, we often didn't even have video. It was just like using the phone. You know, you dial in, like. And so those, you know, that technology has been around for a while. It's been in the field for a while. So the fact that each and every one of you has a robust skill set in that type of digital, you know, online collaboration is tremendous. Like it's not to be underestimated. It could be difficult finding work. So I think as you were talking about, Melissa, like the power of the CC, like follow the instructions on the website, you know, for a job post, you know, to a T, and send it to that person, but also CC the person you know. And, you know, I've done something a little coy, or you know, like I'll have a little section on my one-page resume where I'll put references when I know that someone knows a person that I know, you know. So that's another little trick to kind of get that connection once it's detached from your email and it's just a PDF floating around in somebody else's office. That you know, that connection is kind of hitched to your resume. And then you know, actually starting work or an internship is also interesting. And you know, don't underestimate the power of, you know, like being proactive and like setting meetings and having one-on-one check-ins with your project managers, your supervisors, your peers, and communicate about communicating. You know, I think that's you're all well versed in these tools. You're likely going to be entering a realm with a bunch of professionals who have way less time to give you than you might give each other. So that's just something to maybe adjust to. And I've had a lot of success in setting meetings and setting my own agenda, you know, thinking about what I need to get out of or from a supervisor, a coworker, whomever, when I enter that meeting for even if just 5 or 10 minutes. And I think the last thing I want to say is just draw, like iterate. We are often the people in the room who are unabashed to just like pull out the trace and draw. And so like the Zoom whiteboard or scribbling over a PDF that's on a screen share is the contemporary equivalent of pulling out the trace or pinning something up on the wall and pulling out a Sharpie, so leverage that and think about, how you can make your own workflow or keep your own workflow light and nimble and eliminate steps, and oftentimes I'm making dumb little cartoon drawings that just are good enough to communicate the idea. And, it's often surprising how far those little cartoons can go in driving decisions. So don't be bashful when it comes to drawing.
I think the one thing I would add kind of about that as you're going to the office, I think one of the challenges that you all should kind of keep in mind is, given that so much of this work is happening remote, the onboarding process is really different. And I think one of the unfortunate aspects is so much of the learning that happens when you start a job is the informal learning about hearing conversations, hearing someone else on the phone, hearing someone else doing a design crit, hearing other people have conversations. And so what I would encourage you to do is figure out what is the new mechanism to do that. Whether, you're using, if your firm is using, Google for their process. And so you set up Google Chats and Hangouts so you can have some of that dialogue and discussion and have a little bit more of the back and forth. I know it can sometimes, all the emails that end up popping up, sometimes you just have to pick up the phone. But I think trying to figure out, different mechanisms to make sure that you're getting some of that exposure until we have more of an in-office presence. I do think that will happen at some point. So much of us, really kind of need that kind of a context, but it's not ever probably going to be quite the same thing. And so I think we're all kind of learning through a variety of different cues to try and help address that, because to me, that's the thing that I've been seeing for some of our more recent hires. That's been harder, is just because they aren't in the same room. We've done some weird things where we've just set up a Google chat and people just have it on the side and people are just working away. So you hear the informal conversations, just like you're talking to someone across, the next little desk over on occasion, for like an hour, just so you have it. But just kind of know that that's one of the things that you're probably going to be a little bit more aggressive about, kind of reaching out and having some of that conversation, just because that's the way things are kind of rolling at this point.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We've been experiencing that even in studio, those organic things that happen where you just step over and have something, kind of come up from conversation and having that direct dialogue. It's just, there's a few more, it's not as nimble as, as being in the same room. I'm not seeing, it looks like, thank you, Melissa, for answering Sam's question in the chat there. I don't know, does anybody else have any other questions that they'd like to ask for the panel? We did have one more ourselves, but we want to make sure that we have time for folks who are joining us. If there was anything else that they would like to know.
Do you have a question, Melissa?
Well, I actually had one more comment I was thinking about. One of the pluses about everyone essentially working remotely is we're all becoming geographically agnostic. You should look far and wide, because now is the time to go after that job in New York, and you don't have to live there. You could potentially have that job and stay in Eugene and or wherever. But I think for a lot of the, kind of high demand cities, they're incredibly expensive to live in. I mean, it's ridiculous, when you try and think about how those things go through. The plus is that you don't necessarily have to be in that city. And I think a lot of firms are getting a little bit better about that, because all of our employees are working remote. I mean, I oversee, 70 people in 10 different offices in different places. And one group they're supposed to be based in Berkeley, but I have people that are living in Berkeley, Germany, LA, and New York. And that's the Berkeley crew. And multiple people. So it doesn't really matter. So that is a huge boon. So look big, look for the firms that you're really interested in. This is a chance where it's going to be a lot easier. Now, granted, you can't get past, seeing a site, and there's pieces we'll get to that. But I think it's a really interesting time to be thinking about the fact that where you are is actually not quite as important. There are ways to work around it, but it also means that you can actually probably live more affordably than a lot of these places too. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, or it at least gives you the option. I know at least our office is looking and open to hiring people with the intent eventually when when permits a move to collaborate and whatnot. But we've got like a bunch of small offices scattered, so even that's kind of flexible in its own way. But I just wanted to rewind a little bit back to the online communication tools and how to leverage your portfolio in that process. Practice with each other. So, again, portfolio is, the purpose of it is to get you the interview. Then during the interview itself, it's always good when answering questions, have it ready and practice, pulling it up, getting to the page you need to go to and zooming in on that one drawing, and then walking someone through your thoughts, just like you would if you unfolded it, pushed it across the table and you're pointing at things. Just be sure that you're not going into the meeting cold, that you're deciding in advance, like, do I want to go full screen and zoom in and out? Like, do I have my shortcuts ready, all in Adobe? Just be prepared for that, because time is precious in those interviews, and you just want to be sure that you're making it work for you. And it's, again, like a good way to show off.
Yeah, and I'll take team on that. And when there are technical issues, because that will happen, just don't get flustered. Just, kind of just know enough about kind of what you're saying that you keep going while you're working through and you get the right window, displaying. It happens all the time. I've had it happen in interviews. I had it happen in one interview 4 times where we lost the screen faded. We won the job. It's just kind of like this whole point about like, don't get so flustered. It happens. You just kind of talk through it. You continue the conversation. But, how you work under pressure, that's a great selling tool. But I do think, to the extent you can practice and ideally not have technical issues, that's just helpful. Just, again, what you're trying to convey and making sure that you're setting that up so that you're presenting yourself as best as you can, because that is essentially what you're doing, is you're giving us a glimpse of who you are.
Yeah, and you never know what you're going to get with an interview. Like, I've had interviews and conducted interviews where we've got time. Like I say, like I kind of run out of questions, and I'm asking somebody like, well, why don't you walk me through show me your portfolio, and it's like, so being on the receiving end of that, you should be ready with like, your 30 seconds, flip through, like, oh, here are a couple projects, the 5 minute, and then like maybe the 10-15 minute. But what you don't want to do is take 45 minutes to flip somebody through each and every aspect, each and every drawing. I've found that, when I'm interviewing people, like it's much better when they're using the portfolio as a tool to illustrate something that's come up in conversation. And then the portfolio can kind of remain on the side, or like, ideally as the applicant, like in your hands and kind of in your control a little bit, so that you're kind of using that to illustrate your different skills and things that you've learned or accrued up until this point. I think that's another valuable thing to think about.
Excellent. So I think that once again, I'm not any more questions on there. Are we gonna? Everything's been answered. Seems like everybody's ready to go.
North arrows, scale bars.
Yeah.
Please, like, don't.
Yeah.
You have to
Check
put
your
scale
spelling
bars.
on your labels.
Yes.
Make sure you always do a search for public, because you don't want the other word. It happens all the time. But seriously, do one more check. have your roommate, have someone else take a look through it and just make sure that there's nothing glaring, because it's one of those things where all of a sudden it'll just like pop up and then no one can see anything else.
Your parents are going to read every word, so ask your parents to proofread. But they're the only ones who are going to read every word. Like, you got to understand, like, people get these things, myself included, and I just hit the next button. I'm looking at it, and I'm just kind of giving it a once over to glean, like, is it graphically cohesive? You know, does it read? Is it legible? Like, can I understand this as a document? And then I might reverse and go back through and spend a little more time. But, like, you know, if I tap that next button and nothing really grabs me or piques my curiosity, like Melissa was saying, then it's going to be on to the next person, and they get their own, you know, quick tap. So just think about that, and also, like, you know, don't write too much, and what you do write, make sure it's good, because in that quick little tap, I reverse back to something, and if I read it and it says the other public, it's all over. Like, that has then colored my, you know, and it's unfortunate, but it's the reality. Like, then that's like, oh, this person wasn't really paying much attention, you know, or like, oh, this is a poorly written blurb, you know. So just make sure that what you do include is nice and tight. It's almost better to be more concise and strike an economy of your words, rather than try and tell someone every single thing you worked on during the course of the studio.
There you go. A poet, be a poet or a songwriter, concise and clear. We want to make sure that everybody gets just a couple minutes break here before we go into breakout room. Remember that the breakout rooms, well, we're going to come back on at 6:20 so everybody can introduce themselves, the reviewers, and then we'll get going on that. And remember the Miro board, Taylor has put the link for the Miro board up if there's questions that you want to add on to there, and people can tap into there and see, have a conversation through there as well. But feel free to take a few minutes break and we'll hop back on, ready for more. Thanks again for that. That was
fun. Thank you, Keegan and Melissa. Silent applause.